This is the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook. Today is September 17th, 2023. Please tell us your name and the years you were at Hofstra Radio.
Sure, my name is Stu Rushfield, and I was at Hofstra from, let's see, it would have been September or August. I don't know, when does school start?
I think it typically started in September back in the 80s.
Yeah. Back then. Yeah, that would have been 85, and I graduated in December of 89.
The four and a half year plan.
Yes.
Yes, which I think many of us were on.
Well, I know. I finished a lot faster than you, but that shouldn't make you feel badly.
So tell the people what your titles and positions were at Hofstra Radio.
Let's see. Titles and positions. I had 2 titles, and positions depended on how many people were attacking me and beating me up. Usually prone was the most prominent position that I had. Mm-hmm. Let's see. So I was the assistant sports director to Glenn Koch. And then I became the sports director for the last year and a half or 2 years, or
right, something like that.
Yeah, but I did lots of other stuff there as well.
As many folks I think did at some point.
It was a requirement.
Sure,
back then. Should be now. Maybe it is.
Did you have, this is going to be a dangerous question, did you have any nicknames or on-air names at the station?
Ooh.
You went by Stu Rushfield all the time.
I did. I remember back in those days, I really wanted to be a sportscaster.
Sure.
And I thought often about shortening my name to just Stu Rush, because it sounds kind of snappy and cool. And actually, that ended up being my Twitter, my social media handle.
Right.
But no, I went by Rushfield. I was a dutiful son who didn't want to anger the family too much, in the hopes of getting some kind of inheritance down the road someday, which never came.
Let's talk about the early history of Stu Rushfield.
Yeah.
What first brought you down to the radio station?
Oh, I thought you were talking about the really early history. I was born. No. So Hofstra was actually my second college that I went to. I actually first went to SUNY Geneseo.
I did not know that, actually.
The year before, yeah. But my best friend growing up was Pete Caldera, who had gone to Hofstra. And I went to Geneseo, and I began my radio career at WGSU, 89.3 on your FM dial, where I did so I thought it was really cool when they offered me the opportunity to be the Saturday night DJ on the radio station.
Okay.
Until I found out that it was really just because all the other people at the station had a life, and and they didn't want to be stuck in the radio station on a Saturday night. But I took full advantage, Tony, full advantage of that. And I began the legendary program Alphabet Stew on GSU, in which I played music from A to Z, artists from A to Z.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Every Saturday night. And it was good. It was a lot of fun. Somewhere there must be an air check, I'm sure.
Is it specific kind of music or all over the place?
It was kind of, whatever I liked. So it was a little more like rock kind of things. The only tricky thing, as I recall, was every week when you would get to the letter X, there weren't many choices.
Sure.
There was a band that went by the name of X.
So it was a band name, not a song name.
It was a band name, right?
Oh, okay.
So, for example, B was Beatles, C was Chicago,
Sure.
D was Def Leppard.
I thought maybe it was song name, and you probably played Xanadu multiple times.
I could have done that.
Could have done that, sure.
I enjoy Xanadu, still do. It's a fine motion picture. But no, I don't think that ever made it onto Alphabet Stew.
Wow.
And of course, I took requests from the vast audience in Geneseo, New York.
So what caused you to leave Geneseo and go to Hofstra?
So here's the deal. I learned when October rolled around there in western New York, the sun went down, and it never came back. It just stayed gray the entire time. Gray and cold.
Sure.
And so I actually went back for the beginning of my second semester. And then I just wasn't feeling it.
Sure.
I think it was probably a little too far from home.
Yeah.
So I was a sensitive young lad then, as I am now. And so I ended up leaving and ended up working for a semester, and then applied to Hofstra. And because Pete Caldera, my good friend, who I met in second grade when he moved to my hometown of New City, New York, because he was at Hofstra, I thought, well, maybe I'll go there too. He was telling me how great it was.
Wow.
And it proved to be an excellent, excellent choice.
Now I know you and Pete obviously grew up in the same. Pete lived in New City as well, right? I'm assuming.
Yep.
So you knew Pete, and actually quite a few folks from your area.
Yeah.
And from your school. What school high school did you go to?
So I went to Clarkstown South High School, and that was in West Nyack, New York. It was great because we actually had a TV studio in our high school, which was, I don't think, very common back then. And it was really great because, it gave us a chance to learn a lot of production stuff, and gave us a chance to get in front of the camera, behind the camera, and do all that kind of stuff. So it was a really good building block. And Pete was same year, same grade as me. So we spent a lot of time together. In fact, we did the very first remote broadcasts of the big rivalry games between Clarkstown South and Clarkstown North.
Right.
Still have a couple of those on VHS. If I could only find a VHS player.
Yeah, sure.
We might see those again. And also, Marshall Hausfeld, who was a freshman, I believe, when I was a senior. He also, I met him at the TV studio. And then he ended up following us to Hofstra a few years later. And I am still in touch with him to this day. Why, I'm not sure.
And so all three of you, and I know Marshall has a good, obviously a very good video background. He's been with MSNBC for many years, quarter of a century at least now, I think it is for him. And he started, he really started that love. I know I've talked to him and he's done interviews here where he started his love of all that back at Clarkstown South and that TV studio. And I get the feeling it meant a lot to all three of you.
It did. It did. We had a great teacher, the guy who really kind of built the studio from ground up. His name was HRAAY Schuster. And he was a mentor, and he encouraged us to check out all the different aspects of production. And that was really cool because it taught me that, it's not all about being on the air, being the face in front of a camera, but that all the other jobs are important to the production. And that has stuck with me for many, many years.
Let's get back to WRHU, which was the era that you and I were there for and still is today.
Some would call it an error.
So getting back to the station, what was it like when the first time you went to the station. Now it was, I don't remember. You have a better memory of this than I do, but the initial building that it was in when you and I started was not Memorial Hall. Well, it wasn't in the basement of Memorial Hall.
It was not in the... Oh, that's right. I forgot. It was upstairs, right? Yeah. And that's where the radio station office was.
Yes.
And I remember that well because we had, so Glenn Koch, who was our sports director, actually,
Andy Hirschhorn.
Andy Hirschhorn was the sports director the first year I was there.
Right.
Glenn Koch became sports director the second year. But one of my greatest memories is that first year happened to be one of the years of the 17-year cycle of the cicadas.
Okay.
And so there were cicadas all over Hofstra.
Uh-huh.
It was maddening, the sound. But I remember the best part, the most memorable part to me, is that Glenn Koch and Ben Buchwald, who are, two of the sports guys at RHU, they would take a copy of a photo of Jeff Krause, our station general manager, the dignified, gray-haired, gray-bearded, serious guy. And they would make a lot of photocopies, and then they would take cicadas who had expired, and they would glue the photo of Jeff's head onto the cicadas, and they would leave them all over his desk.
Oh, boy.
So it would be cicadas with his likeness staring at him.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was fun. I think that's when Jeff began his dislike of me, at least.
Yeah. So the first time you come down to that station, I've talked about this on these podcasts before, what it was like first coming down and the impression I got from a lot of the people who were there. So you walk into the office the first time. What was it like? Who did you meet? What was the initial thought you had when you walked into the office and met a bunch of people there?
Well, I'm going to be honest. I don't remember a lot about the first meeting.
Sure.
I remember being intimidated.
Yeah.
You know, I remember Jeff Krause, who was our GM, with a big booming radio voice and, very intimidating presence. So I was definitely a little scared. And, it's always hard when you walk into a new place, especially after being the star of Alphabet Stu.
Yeah,
I mean,
of course.
I'm sure you can imagine.
Yes, absolutely.
My concern. Anyway, to be honest, I don't remember a lot. I remember going to like the student fair, I guess it was, that happens every semester.
Right.
Where they have all the organizations and clubs, and you can go and check out the things that you might be interested in. And I don't know, I ended up going to RHU, and I remember back in the day there was an announcer's test and some other stuff that you had to pass. But I just, I wanted to be a sports guy, and I gravitated immediately to the sports guys who became not only friends then, but lifelong friends. I'm trying to be diplomatic. I was about to make a sarcastic joke about you, but I won't, because here we are almost 40 years later.
Yeah.
And you've allowed me into your home to do this. So.
And it's late, and
it's late.
You don't want to be kicked out.
Exactly.
Understood.
Exactly.
Smart.
It's hard to find a hotel this time of night. Anyway, but I just remember everybody at the station actually was really welcoming. And it was just a good atmosphere. It was like I had found my people.
I can't tell you how often I've heard that from others who have done interviews. I've said the same thing myself. And I think it's a very common, experience that most people have. But the intimidation part early on, and then eventually over time, you realize, hey, I fit in here.
Oh, yeah. And, it was kind of interesting because, there were different parts of the station. So there were the sports guys who everybody thought were just a bunch of, yokels who weren't serious about anything. And then there were like the shortwave music show, right? It was shortwave? Airwave, thank you. Sorry, NPR has a podcast called Shortwave.
There you go.
So I confused it. But Airwave, right. There were the Airwave people who were way too cool for me.
Of course.
The music, the kids who were into the alternative music and that kind of thing. There were like the news people who were very serious. But eventually, everyone just became friends.
Yeah.
And it was a really great place. I spent way more time in that radio station over my years than I ever did studying, for sure.
Sure.
But I will also say that even though my degree was in radio and television production, I think the value I got from being at the radio station for all that time really kind of far exceeded the value I got from the classes, which is not to say the classes weren't good or important, but just to get your hands on, to get your feet dirty and wet, it was a great way to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do remember one of the requirements for being on the air, if you wanted to be a sports guy, well, you had to take another shift on the station. So I ended up taking one of the Good Morning Hofstra classical music shifts, which I didn't know Beethoven from Bach, or I had no idea what I was doing, but all I knew was I was playing stuff on the radio and talking, and as a freshman, that was a pretty cool deal.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier about announcing classes and engineering classes. Anything memorable about those experiences, being in an announcing class or an engineering class? Who taught you in those classes? What did you learn from them?
I still think all the time about the 4-track studio we had, which seems so primitive now that, you can easily have dozens, if not hundreds of, channels in a mix these days when you're talking about digital. But I just remember how mind-blowing it seemed to be for people to be able to use 4 tracks of audio at the same time. And I remember how scary it seemed to me. And the announcing classes were great. I don't have a lot of specific memories of them, but I just know that there was a lot from Jeff Krause about enunciation and projection and things like that. And I have annoyed my own children for many years talking about enunciating properly so people can understand you. And then when they mumble, I remind them. They're getting a little tired of it.
Yeah.
And they're walking around the house with shovels, and I'm not quite sure what those are for.
So going from the classes, and then you finally get your first chance to do something on the air. Do you recall or remember the first time you were behind the board, or the first time you were on the air live at RHU?
Well, I remember being on the board for a while because, you had to work your way up. I remember being on the board during the football games and basketball games and that kind of thing. And I didn't have a ton of experience with engineering stuff, but when you're doing it live, you learn quickly.
Right.
And you make mistakes, and you learn that that's okay.
Right.
It's college. And even now, even all these years later as a professional, I tell young people, if you make a mistake, it's okay. It's only radio.
Right.
Now, I will say that, but then I also will tell you that if I make a mistake on the air, I beat myself up about it for a good solid week. But I still try to tell people that it's okay, even though I feel like it's not okay for me because I'm a perfectionist. Yeah, I just remember, learning how to mix and how to do crossfades and crossfading the crowd noise of a football game with the music and, dropping somebody doing updates over on top of the music, that kind of thing. It was all just very cool. It was kind of like being a DJ in a sense. And then I we also then we had to essentially, okay, this is going to sound so super dated, but we had to start, I'm going to say it, start at the bottom, which meant if you were lucky, you got to do women's basketball. And that was where you started. And then, if you did okay on that, then you might work your way up to, doing color commentary on basketball or color commentary on the football games, that kind of thing. Hofstra, I should mention Hofstra at one time had a football team when we were there, and it was excellent. And it was not like a powerhouse across the country, but in Division III, which is where we were a very strong program. And anyway, so eventually did the engineering stuff, got to do some of the women's games, which was really great experience too. And eventually worked my way up and got to go to all kinds of interesting places and have a lot of fun traveling with the football team and the basketball team, even though I also will point out that the basketball team was just putrid back in those days. Really not good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me just go a little bit off track of what we've been talking about. Not far off, though. You mentioned how you became sports director at one point. Is that something that you wanted to do? And after you had the experience of doing it, do you feel it was worth doing it, or would you have preferred to just worry more about doing games? Because it's nice to say, yes, I was the head of, but then when you have a love like sports broadcasting, like you and I both have, and you get a chance to do that, then you take over, and then you have to deal with scheduling, you have to deal with other announcers being there, all that kind of stuff. So as a sports director, how was that experience, and do you feel like it was a positive thing to have done?
There were parts of it that were challenging. For example, as you mentioned, scheduling. Trying to be fair, trying to give a fair amount of games to each person so people would get the experience. But it led to some hard feelings at times. Sure. Because people didn't always get the assignment that they were hoping for. But the cool thing I think about being the sports director was back then we had to make our own arrangements for, back then it was phone lines for doing games on the road. It was making travel arrangements for, planes or rental cars or this or that. And, it was getting in touch with the sports information directors from the other schools. So there was just a lot of, I'm sure a lot of people would consider it kind of paperwork, but it was all so important because it just kind of gave you this foundation for this stuff just doesn't happen magically. Right. Somebody actually has to do the work to get the game on the air eventually. Right. So I actually found from an organizational point of view, it actually it taught me a lot more about the business than if I just wanted to show up once a week and do a football game.
Right. So let's go on a little more of the fun part of it. And I think you and I have partaken in doing a show or two with a lot of the other sports guys of that time and told stories. Is there like one story that really stands out that kind of epitomizes the time at RHU and doing sports? It could be something funny. It could be something that, where you really realize, hey, this has been a lot of fun. Is there, a road story or a game story that you have that you always think about when you think about doing sports at RHU?
Yeah. There was a basketball game. We went up to Providence College to do a game there with Marshall Hausfeld, and we were setting up our equipment. And it was very shortly before game time. And I took this power strip that we had, and I plugged something into it. And all of a sudden, there was a flash of fire and smoke, and it scared the daylights out of me. And yeah, that's when I learned the importance of bringing extra backup equipment. Because I think we found a way to find another power strip that somebody was able to lend us. But wow, that was alarming and crazy and funny in retrospect. And I think it was also at that game where I started the broadcast and I said something like, from the blah 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 arena in and then I turned to Marshall and I said, "Where are we, Marsh?" And he said, "Providence, Stu. We're in Providence." There are a lot of good times. Just traveling, with the other sports guys.
Sure.
Traveling with the team was a lot of fun. Actually, I do have a great memory. We were doing a basketball game at Ohio University, Athens, Ohio, the Bobcats. And I remember in the morning, our team had the morning shoot-around in the arena. And I was there that morning, and I started shooting three-pointers. Now, let me tell you, I've always been an absolutely awful athlete. Almost no talent whatsoever. But that day, there was magic in the arena. And I started hitting three-pointer after three-pointer. And after a few, the team started, taking notice. And I remember there was the quote that sticks with me to this day was, radio guy, what do you say, radio guy?" And of course, then I got a little nervous and I'm sure clanged a few. But I hit a bunch that day, and it was like, maybe I should be on the court. And then I woke up and I realized, no, you're awful at basketball. But I do remember that. Oh, can I share one other story? Sorry. One other story was, and perhaps this wasn't the nicest thing we could have done, but there was a player on the basketball team who had never flown before. He was a freshman. And Glenn Koch and I boarded the plane. We were sitting right in front of him. He was telling us how nervous he was. And then as the plane began to taxi down the runway, Glenn loudly started quoting completely made-up statistics. And with this poor freshman nervous in the seat behind us said, "Stu, did you know that 85% of all airline fatalities occur during takeoff or landing?" And I still remember the poor guy just melting into his chair behind us. And anyway, there are a lot of good times. The two things I always talk about, very brief stories, are
including you, are one time being back in the studio and hearing you set up for a game, hearing you setting up the mixer, and all of a sudden we hear like an electronic sound, and then we hear you scream.
That must have been the one.
And yeah, you getting shocked.
Yes.
And we were laughing hard in the studio.
That must have been that game.
And somehow you got back on the air again.
Yeah.
And the other story that I always tell people is one time in intercession, you were staying on campus. I was still helping at the radio station. Clemson comes to town to play the boys basketball team.
Yeah.
And you and I were both sick as dogs.
Oh, yeah.
With the flu or so, and nobody was there to do the game, and it was Clemson.
Yeah.
We got to do the game, Stu.
We got to do it.
And we dragged ourselves out of our homes, and probably one of the better broadcasts I think we ever had. We did that game really sick, and I just remember both of us looking at each other like, I'm going to die. I hope this game ends soon. But we still did a heck of a game. But that's what you did back then. You dragged yourself out of bed even if you were sick and did a game.
That's kind of, when you go into the business of broadcasting or anything really, you gotta show up. You gotta show up to play.
Yeah.
And yeah, some days you're not feeling your best, and some days you don't want to get out of bed.
Yeah.
But there is a job to do. I mean, all these things, being at Hofstra, being at WRHU, taught me those things. There are details that you may just not want to bother with. You may just want to get on the air and have the couple of hours of glory doing a game on the radio. But boy, there's so much more to it. And it's, to me, there are a lot of days where I might wake up now and not feel like doing what I do, but I get up and do it because there's a whole country waiting to be entertained or informed, and you do what you got to do.
Let's get back on the track of your time at RHU. And we haven't really talked about others. Not a few others you've mentioned, obviously Pete Caldera, Marshall Hausfeld, and a few others. But who were the people who were really helpful to you early on, and even as you went on? Who were the people who were really helpful to you initially in your early days at RHU?
Well, there were people like our station manager, Dave Bolender, who I remember being super encouraging.
Yeah.
Jeff Krause, an interesting character. Like I said, very intimidating, but underneath he was just a squishy softy.
Yeah.
And what I learned about Jeff is if he saw talent in you, if he saw promise in you, he would be harder on you than he would on most of the other people.
Right.
But he did it for a reason, because he knew that you could do more. There was more he could get out of you. And I thought that's an important lesson that I learned. There was a time when I thought it was just sometimes being a little rude or a little harsh, and then I realized it was actually coming from a really good place. So Jeff, and then there were other people who I used to enjoy watching. Jim Vazios was kind of a technical wizard back then. Let's see. There are all kinds of people. Adam Foss, right? Adam? Am I saying that right? Adam Foss, who did the post-punk...
Jeff Foss,
I'm sorry. So there was Jeff Foss, who did it was called P5. Was it the
Yep.
post-pop punk progression Pop Party or something like that. I don't know. I think I just turned it into a P6 just now. Anyway, but that was a late night, like Saturday night show. And it was actually, I remember, very impressive watching.
It might have been one of the first times, well, certainly the first time that I think I met Buster Rhymes down there. That was a great thing about Jeff. You got to meet some really interesting, people who were starting to get a name in the rap world, and he had them down there at the radio station on Saturday night.
Yep.
And I got to meet quite a few that wound up becoming big names. And yeah, I mean, I think that was probably one of the great things about RHU was having people who were on the cutting edge of some different things.
It's true, and I mean, right now we're celebrating like 50 years of rap music, and a lot of those people were at RHU back in those days.
Absolutely,
pretty amazing stuff. But there were other people too who I really admired. Because they allowed us to preempt their shows.
Yeah, sure.
So Tony Jackson did this
the
Irish music show on Saturday afternoons, and he would always get bumped because we had football or basketball. Mm-hmm. But he was just such a delightful man.
Absolutely.
And he was not a student. He was a grown up, and he was a volunteer at the station. And help me with the Polish music show that we had.
Well, I think when we first got there, it was Sweet Olson,
right? It was Sweet,
and then Basha later on.
Basha,
yes,
yep. And I don't know, they were great. They were like having moms and dads, right there at the station. They were just so encouraging, and didn't give us the evil eye, even though we were taking away their audiences. And their audiences actually, I remember for station pledge drives and that kind of thing, their audiences actually really ponied up.
Yeah.
So
absolutely,
it was kind of rough for us to to be interrupting their shows when their shows actually brought in some money for the station. But I don't know. There were just all kinds of people. There were talented people, not just from the beginning, but as time went on. There was Dave Mock, who was very intense, very serious news person.
Yeah.
It's so sad. Dave passed a number of years ago,
Yeah.
But he went on to work for CBS, and he was so serious about news.
I would make the case that the Hofstra Radio Hall of Fame, and I don't think they've put him in, but they should put him in posthumously for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree. He was just so committed and so serious about doing the news. Other people though, who were fun, who were not from the sports department. Lori Cates, who was another one of those really cool kids who did the alternative music shows, and then went on to work at WLIR and I'm forgetting her.
Up in Boston too as
well.
Yeah,
right? What is her station up in Boston that she worked at?
She'll be mad now. I'm not cutting this out. I want her to hear that you don't remember.
Anyway, she was like super good and super talented, and there were other people from our years, and actually one thing I really find interesting is that people did go into different areas, into different directions. We had Tony Sibilla, for example, who wound up, we both wound up working at WABC, and then Tony was doing Chicago Bulls, engineering Chicago Bulls games.
That seems like a lifetime ago.
During the height of the Jordan years. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I haven't. I haven't seen The Last Dance.
Yeah,
but and I love people talking about it, and especially younger folks who, it's this mythical time, and I'm like, I was kind of there, but yeah, it was I think it's interesting the different paths. I think you're absolutely right. The different paths that we've all taken to a certain extent. Somehow we all either are still in or got back to broadcasting in one way, shape, or form. And in my mind, WRHU was help us gain the love of doing that. I always felt like I wanted to do radio. It wasn't until I got to WRHU that I really fell in love with it and everything about it.
There's somebody else I need to mention, who is a new inductee into the Hofstra Radio Hall of Fame, which is Sue Ronneberger. And Sue Ronneberger was a student and worked at, it was probably actually WVHC at the time. Maybe transitioning to RHU. But she had worked there years before and then became an engineer at WABC. And when I was leaving the station for my very last final exam in December of 1988, the phone rang as I was walking out of the radio station office, and Jeff Krause answered the phone, and I was, on my way out the door, and all of a sudden, before the door closed, I heard Jeff yelling, Stu? And I turned around and went back in, and it turned out that Sue Ronneberger, former Hofstra Radio person, still cared enough about Hofstra Radio that she called because WABC was looking for some vacation relief engineering help.
Right.
And Jeff thought of me because I was, I guess probably because I was standing there at the time the phone rang. But yeah, she called. She said, is there anybody who's like graduating who might be interested in doing this, who you think would be good? And 2 weeks later, I was sitting at the controls of WABC, like the biggest talk station in America, sweating through my pores, and engineering. If I can go into that just a tiny bit more.
Sure.
So I had to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning. Sue was engineering the morning show, which I believe was the Dave Dawson show back then. Didn't last very long, but so I'm there that day. I get there at 6 o'clock in the morning, all excited to be there, and I'm watching them do the first hour of the show. And it was really cool, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is really amazing. And then at 7 o'clock, the network news comes on, which is when everybody gets to take a little breather for a couple of minutes. And Sue Ronneberger, who was engineering and, showing me how to do things and stuff, she stands up when the news comes on, and she says, okay, your turn. And I was like, ha, 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 that's funny, Sue Ronneberger. And she looked at me, she's like, no, I mean it. Sit down. And so when we started that very next hour, I was at the controls of this like giant blowtorch of a radio station. And it was absolutely terrifying. But you know what? I did it.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't remember. Maybe it was perfect. Maybe it wasn't perfect. I don't know. But that's how you learn.
Kim Kallenberg did the same thing to me the first. I trained with her at ABC about a month after you started.
Right.
And she kind of did the same, threw me in the deep end and said, sink or swim. And I thank her, in my mind, I thank her every day for doing that for me.
Absolutely. I mean, you can really get hung up in your mind about, can I do this? Am I good enough to do this?
Yeah.
Well, you find out quickly when you have no choice but to find out.
And just to get back at your mention of Sue Ronneberger and all the others who wound up working at WABC, who were Hofstra Radio alums, who kept that who kept that pipeline coming so that you and me and Steve Goldman and others after us had a chance to go work at a major radio station coming out of college. If it weren't for people like Sue, we wouldn't have had that opportunity. And again, we should be thanking them every time we see them.
Absolutely. And it was crazy. Like, for example, just being able to be like the engineer on the board for the New York Yankees radio network in the studio. Now, you actually did it in the booth.
Yeah.
Which was crazy. And actually, that happened to be the first year that John Sterling started broadcasting
1989, yep.
And John Sterling is still at it as of this year. And one of the neatest things that I remember was having the opportunity to visit up in the booth over there and being able to walk down the hall and go see Bob Shepard.
Yeah.
You can probably, I know you can do this. I can't do a good Bob Shepard, but Bob Shepard was the legendary Yankee Stadium announcer for years. And it would sound something like this when, for example, Derek Jeter would come to bat.
Oh no! You know the impersonation I do is Bob Shepard. Because before the games you'd go get food before the game.
Oh yeah!
And so I was online one time with Bob Shepard, and I'll have the number 2 and a large Coke.
That echo
but
followed him all around.
But he would sound like that, and he was the nicest guy in the world. I remember talking to him all the time. My brother came with me to hang out with me while I was engineering a game, and I brought him over to Bob Shepard just to say hello, and he was ecstatic to have met him. Bob would sit there and read a book, and when it was his turn, he would kick his microphone on because there was a kick switch on the floor, and he would announce the batter. But he was the nicest guy. All these cool things we're talking about all go back to WRHU and getting to know people and getting to be respected by those who came before us, given a chance to do some great things. And, again, it's all because college radio started us down this path.
Yep. And actually, you mentioned that. And then I think about our time at WRHU, which led to our time at WABC.
Yep.
At WABC, when we were there was a young Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Who was...
I think he was only about on the air for about 6 months at that point when we started.
Right. He was pretty new in New York. And at that time, he was actually doing 2 hours locally in New York and then 2 hours nationally.
Yep.
Nationally, at that time, I think he was up to about 240 radio stations, which was still, early into the ascent and the explosion of, his popularity. And, however, so Sue Ronneberger was looking for engineers. Jeff Krause pointed me in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
I wound up working at WABC. I wound up working with Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Who then 7 years later gave me a great letter of recommendation when I went to CBS Radio.
Right.
Because he was friends with Mary Madeline, who was a Republican pundit,
I guess.
Pundit.
Yeah.
Thanks. And they were good friends.
Yeah.
And Mary saw that I had worked with him, and she called him up, and he gave me a glowing review.
Yeah.
And that, started with RHU.
Let's wrap it up with this final question as we...
Final question?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm wide awake, Tony, aren't you?
You better not be.
I could go all night.
Yeah, I'm sure you could, but...
I think I've already put everyone else to sleep.
What did you think Hofstra Radio would mean to you when you first started doing? Obviously, you were at Geneseo beforehand, but when you got to Hofstra Radio and you started working there and you did sports and you become the sports director, what was your thought? What was Hofstra Radio going to mean to you in those early days? Did you see that as being a stepping stone to your career? What did you think you were going to get out of that time at Hofstra Radio?
Yeah, I really felt it was like a launching pad for us, and I had big plans. I was certain that by the time I reached, I hit 40 years old, I was going to be doing play-by-play for Monday Night Football.
Yeah.
And life happens and careers take different twists and turns. But it was really, I thought I was going to be a big-time play-by-play guy. And I really wanted to be. And I think I just didn't have the guts to go to like a really small station somewhere in the middle of nowhere and, eat tuna fish out of a can and peanut butter from a jar and, barely be able to pay rent, if at all. So I really admire the people who did go through, went down that road. I ended up sticking with the engineering path. But without RHU, I just wouldn't have known about all the things that make up, a radio station and all the pieces that there are and the jobs, and it's just amazing. And just the organization of it all has really helped, me throughout my career. So I thought it was going to go one way, and it went a totally different direction. But I have to say I ended up doing a few stories on the air for NPR over the past couple of years, and it brought me back to those times because it was so fun getting behind the mic. But it was not only doing that, it was like being back at Hofstra in a way, because suddenly I was there, I was writing my stories, I was recording tape, I was coming back and editing the tape, I was producing the entire thing, voicing the stories. So it was like all these things that we were taught at RHU came back together, 30, 40 years later, whatever it is. And it's just the things that you learn, the lessons that you take from that, that really can last a lifetime. And not only that, but just the friends that you make and continue to keep, so many years later. It is a special place. It is a place that I feel really, really lucky that I was able to be a part of it. Now, would it have been just as great if I had been at, Syracuse or Ithaca, which were the other two schools that I wanted to go to, but were too expensive? Might have been great. They had great communications programs. But wow, the education that I got at Hofstra and the experience I got because people let me do it.
Right.
They just, they were like, okay, you want to do more? Sure, do more. That is something you can never learn in a classroom. But the experience at the radio station just gave me opportunities to look at every different angle of broadcasting. And it has led to a long career at NPR and doing a show that is heard by 13 million people every week. And, it's been a pretty decent career. I owe a lot of it to a lot of the people I met at Hofstra and just the great people I had the chance to work with during that time.
Well, Stu, thanks. I appreciate you taking the time. And, obviously you and I have known each other for a long time, did a lot of sports together.
A little too long, in my opinion.
But, just talking about these stories makes it all, it ratifies what you were just saying, how all that experience and information, it's important, and it was worth all of it at RHU. And maybe we got an experience at RHU that wasn't, because it wasn't overly structured it allowed us to learn, to take steps and to fall and to get back up and take steps again. And I think that's one of the things I always loved about RHU. It allowed you to make those mistakes, and then you learned to correct them. You were told how to correct them or what you needed to do to get back on the horse again, and you did that. And I think that's what any college radio station should do: allow you to make the mistake and then get you to learn from that and be a better broadcaster.
There's no better way to learn than by screwing things up. And I was really outstanding at that. But in the end, you make mistakes, you learn from them, you move on. Maybe you make that same mistake occasionally again, but you just build. Every time you learn something, it adds up, it builds. Before you know it, you've had a 40-year career in radio. So I can't complain. I've gotten to do all kinds of great, cool things, been to all kinds of places, met all kinds of neat people over the years, not just at RHU, but professionally. And I would say I'm a pretty lucky guy.